Welcome to session 42, starting year 5 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. This time we're taking up Mary Shelley, and I thought we'd focus on novels that have to do with utopian and anti-utopian ideas and the idea of progress and decline. So I picked out of all of her stuff Frankestein and The Last Man, and only after actually reading The Last Man all the way through, waiting for it to get better, did I discover that there are good reasons why so few people read The Last Man. It got banned in the press when it came out, but it is kind of an interesting thing nonetheless. Of course, she's best known for Frankestein. I think that a lot of people saw her as the literary equivalent of what we nowadays call a one-hit wonder in music because of that. So what we usually do in these talks, besides having a lot of discussion and dialogue about ideas, is go over the biography and the literary works of the person, how they fit in together. And we talk a lot about world building, but with her, as with Bram Stoker and a few of the other people that we've looked at, I don't think we can really say that there's effectively a world that's built. She's writing in the world that, more or less, the world that she lives in. With the short stories, it's you could say much more imaginary landscapes. I suppose you could say the same about The Last Man, where things are kind of idealized. It's supposed to be happening. The Last Man is supposed to be happening, almost a millennium in the future. But Greece and Turkey are still at war, so how different is it really? The country names are all more or less the same, and you do about the same stuff. So I don't know that we'll talk that much about world building, but I think we can talk about world revealing with what goes on in her works and in her life and all of that. So the themes that I'd picked out, I always have some philosophical themes that I think are particularly important. The big elephant in the room is the Frankenstein's monster, creating new life. What sort of responsibility do we bear towards it? So I think there's a lot of implications for that in terms of what we do with animals, what we do with human beings and cloning and genetics, and especially what we do with artificial intelligence. And then there's a corresponding theme of a new, stronger race that would come about. The monster wants a bride in this, and probably rightly so, but Frankenstein thinks that's a bad idea. Another key thing that I think you see running through this, and we'll talk about why it's so central to her ideas, I think it comes a lot out of her biography, is sort of the contrast between a new era of progress and old ways that are holding it back, where you've got Enlightenment and revolution and romanticism on one side, and then monarchy, old-fashioned class distinctions, slavery, warfare, tradition and institutions on the other side. And closely related to that, something that I would call the imperfection of the perfectible as a theme. So, Mary Shelley is the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, both of whom thought that human progress not only should continue, but could pretty much indefinitely continue. Things could get better and better and better. And Shelley, she's a bit more skeptical of that, even as essentially a teenager writing Frankenstein. So she belongs to a different generation, and I think that fits in there. And then another key thing that I thought was an interesting theme that hasn't been talked about that much except among feminist critics is the role that anger as an emotion plays in this work, but also in other works. And so we'll probably talk a bit about the dynamic of anger, how anger functions, and why it's so central to making the plot, because so many points, for example, in Frankestein, there's so many points where things could have worked out, and they don't because somebody is angry at somebody else, filled with rage, and so estrangement and alienation is produced by anger. But I think that, again, that's very reflective of her biography. So we should look at her her life, and I've created this timeline that doesn't actually have a lot of writings in it in terms of novels. Does have some other things in it, travelogues, and she did also do a lot of biographical writing that we'll talk about. So she's born in the very end of the 18th century to two philosophers, Mary Wollstonecraft, who by that time was known not just in England, but I would say, she was growing in reputation in Europe for her vindication of the rights of women. As a matter of fact, when Godwin publishes his ill-advised tell-all biography of her, he calls it something like the memoirs of the biography or something of the author of the vindication of the rights of women. So, unfortunately, and this is one of those things where you think about how would history, at least literary history, how would it have been different had Mary Wollstonecraft survived the birth of her second child. We'll talk about Fanny, her first child, in a bit. Let's say she'd actually survived, because she dies, not immediately in childbirth, but I think about 9 days later of complications. What if she had actually been there to bring up young Mary in the way that she had wanted a young girl to receive what she called an education, and to have a mother's affection? I think things would have been quite different. As it stood, you've got Godwin, who is really, he's an interesting figure in his own right, and I say interesting in the euphemistic sense that he's kind of a messed up character. He writes some interesting things. He is a philosopher in the broad sense. He wants to bring about social progress. He's one of the early utilitarians. He's also one of the early people to formulate consistent anarchism. He meets Wollstonecraft originally at a literary event that's put on to celebrate Thomas Paine's publication of The Rights of Men in London, and Mary Wollstonecraft essentially harangues him all night long, and he has a very disagreeable remembrance of that, but then falls in love with her after she writes her travelogue about travels in Scandinavia. And then they get together, and she gets pregnant, and they decide that in order to afford the child some social legitimacy, they'll get married, and then she dies. So they don't get to spend that much time together. And Godwin is now stuck running a household that he seems not very well suited for doing. He's also got Mary Wollstonecraft's other daughter, too, who at that time is a toddler, Fanny Imlay, born illegitimately to Mary in France. So in 1798, Godwin manages to destroy pretty much all of the goodwill that Mary Wollstonecraft had built up by publishing his biography of Mary Wollstonecraft against the advice of all of his friends, who say, if you reveal this sort of thing, you're going to destroy her reputation, and you're even going to make things difficult for yourself. And he poo-poos them and does it, and sure enough, that's exactly what happens. Because, it's revealed that Mary Wollstonecraft had attempted to commit suicide twice and had an illegitimate daughter. So, it's not Victorian age, but that was still scandalous at the time, right? And then, when Mary Shelley is only 3, Godwin travels to Ireland and leaves his daughters in the care of this guy, James Marshall. The year after that, he returns, and he decides that he needs another wife to help him out in running the household. And he marries this neighbor, Mary Jane Claremont, who most of his friends dislike, think that she's a very vulgar and coarse lady. And she already has a kid too. I think she had 1 or 2 kids from her previous marriage. One of whom is going to become friends with Mary. And, Mary and her don't get along from the beginning. Fanny adjusts herself to dealing with this woman, but Mary never gets along with her stepmother. Eventually, the Godwins, finding themselves deeper and deeper into debt, start a shop and publishing house called the Juvenile Library, publishing stories for kids. That was quite popular at the time. And Mary herself, 1812, she's sent in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars to live in the household of this guy, William Baxter, in Scotland, with his 4 daughters. And she really likes it there. He is a philosophical radical, and so her dad and this guy get along quite well. And then in 1814, she meets Percy Shelley, who's older than her, married, and kind of a bad guy when it comes down to it, when you think about it. And he starts visiting the Godwin household pretty regularly. Godwin is still, as he is, chronically in debt. And Shelley has plenty of money, so Shelley offers to help him out. And then Mary and Percy fall in love, and she loses her virginity to him, according to legend, on the grave of her mother, which is quite probable. Because it was an easy place to get away to. And then she and her stepsister Claire, who had been sort of the favored child because Claire was her stepmother's actual daughter, they leave for Europe with Percy, leaving his pregnant wife behind. So, by this time, everything's been thrown to the wind. And actually, we take a little pause there. So, William Godwin, he didn't like any of this, but he didn't really have that much to complain about because he had been attacking the institution of marriage pretty consistently. And so then, when his own daughter decides that, free love is where it's at and you should follow your heart and it doesn't matter these sort of institutional norms and requirements and stuff like that, I guess it shouldn't be much of a surprise, It's sort of like that old Onion joke where Eminem discovers that there's a young guy who wants to date his daughter because now his daughter is old enough, and that the guy takes his cues from Eminem's lyrics. He suddenly doesn't like it so much anymore, right? I think there's quite a bit of that, and it's also unclear whether it was just Mary being involved with Percy Shelley or whether it was Mary and Claire at different times. Clearly, Mary is enamored with him. So they leave for Europe, and then when they come back, they discover that they've been cut off by William Godwin, their father. And, they're destitute. Percy Bysshe Shelley is essentially run out of his money. She manages, they manage to get her pregnant, and she gives birth prematurely. The baby dies. It's a daughter. And that begins some of her later depression as well. But then their finances begin to improve, mainly due to his family. And then Mary gives birth to their son, William, who again isn't going to live all that long, unfortunately. The couple spends a summer with Lord Byron, with Claire Claremont, her sister, and John William Polidori, and this is where the Frankenstein things comes from, right? They're talking about ghost stories. Everyone's supposed to come up with one for a number of days. Mary can't come up with one and says that she feels very embarrassed because, she should be a good writer and fertile in imagination and intellect, living up to her brilliant mother. And then she comes up with a core for this, and supposedly it comes out of a dream that she has, and she begins working on the idea. And a lot of other things happen in that year as well. Her half-brother Charles leaves for France. Her half-sister Fanny ends up committing suicide, as does Percy's wife. And, Fanny was kind of a tragic character. She's older than Mary, and they were close. But Fanny got tasked with a lot of the household management stuff. And she was always, you could say in terms of her ideas, she was more conservative than the rest of that lot. She thought that class distinctions did matter and you should pay attention to that. And she, you could see her as kind of like a soul just adrift. Her dad, her stepfather, William Godwin, sort of threw a lot on her shoulders, didn't view her as being as intelligent as Mary, didn't, compared her unfavorably with Claire as not being as pretty as Claire. And, you could see her trying to do her best. And a lot of the hostility and anger that was produced because of Mary and Claire leaving fell onto Fanny. And so eventually she does kill herself, taking laudanum. I think Percy's wife drowned herself. That opens up the door for Percy Shelley and Mary to get married, which then produces a reconciliation of the family. So, now things are back on an even keel after all this tragedy. Things aren't going completely great. Their daughter Clara is born. Mary finishes Frankenstein, begins editing Percy's works, but Percy is living away from home a lot of the time to avoid creditors. It's kind of interesting. There's a lot of that at that time. Really, that entire, the 19th century and the 18th century, a lot of the literature is like people removing from one place to another to avoid their creditors, because your creditors could generally only find you at home, So that was a way to stay out of it. And then the entire group relocates to Italy. By this time, Claire has gotten involved with Byron, and she's pregnant, gives birth to a daughter, Alba. And Alba gets handed over to Byron, and she won't live that long either. Most of these children die quite young. Alba is handed over to Byron with the proviso that Claire will have almost no interaction with her daughter. And Byron eventually places her in a convent where she gets sick and dies. And Claire hates Byron to the end of her life. And she lives quite a bit longer, too. 1819, their son William dies. Mary sinks into a depression. The only thing that brings her out is the birth of their one son who does survive, Percy Florence. And she begins writing another, some people think, autobiographical novel, Matilda, which doesn't get very read anymore either. 1822, Mary miscarries and almost dies. Percy is the one who, according to the doctors, saved her by placing her into ice. but he also starts roaming around. And he spends a lot of time with this woman, Jane Williams, who Mary may have been attracted to as well. And not that long after all of that, Percy and several other people die in a boating accident. He dies of drowning. They cremate him, and then Mary relocates to this household of Leigh Hunt in Genoa, and she wants to write a biography, a memoir of her husband, the big love of her life, Percy Bysshe Shelley. And his father prevents it. And it's kind of an interesting side story. It runs throughout the rest of her work. She's always trying to find some way to make this happen. Well, this is actually something good to pause on and talk a bit about. Why would why would his dad be so dead set against having a public account of his kind of crazy son? Because it would destroy the family name. I mean, it's not like anybody didn't know what the son was up to. Maybe it would make it too public. But he puts his foot down. You can't. You may not. Write this sort of thing. And he makes like having he uses the purse strings to control that. You have an allowance provided you don't write anything like that. And she she gets around it in certain ways. Eventually, she returns to England, and she negotiates an allowance for Percy Florence from her husband's father. The second edition of Frankenstein comes out. The first edition of Frankenstein is anonymous. Second edition bears her name, and there's some speculation back and forth about like did Percy have a role in writing it, or is it all her? And I think it's pretty safe to say it's probably all her. 1824, she moves to Kentish Town in London to be near Jane Williams. It seems they may have had some sort of dalliance. That gets soured a bit when Jane Williams reveals to Mary that Percy had said that he was less attracted to Mary than he was to Jane Williams. By 1826, Percy Florence becomes the legal heir of the Shelley estate. Mary is, you could say, she's got more room to maneuver. She begins to assist friends, other people who are writing memoirs of Percy. So there's nothing that says that she can't give other people information. She's just not supposed to do it herself. And, when she was editing Percy's works, which she did over the course of her life, she like with his poetry, she would put in all sorts of information. To understand this poem, you need to know blah, 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 blah. And so she's revealing bits and pieces of his biography by doing so. So pretty clever. 1827, she helps some of her friends obtain false passports. While she's visiting those friends in France, she contracts and gets over smallpox, which effectively destroys her looks, which, in a way, for a widow, is something that you could trade on, but it doesn't appear that she was particularly interested in marrying. She turned down some offers at different points in time from other people. The third edition of Frankenstein comes out in 1831. By this time, she's also written The Last Man and a number of other things, including the short stories. She's churning out the short stories during this time as well in order to be able to make money to live on, because that was quite lucrative. Whereas novel writing, maybe it would be, maybe it wouldn't. It depends on how the novel was reviewed. 1832, her brother dies. She begins contributing pieces to what's called the Cabinet Cyclopedia, which is a number of biographical entries published in volumes. I mean, this is, again, kind of a thing of the time. You'd get people to subscribe, and that would give you the capital to churn out these interesting things, and people would line their walls with it. It was very, very much a bourgeois kind of thing. 1838, she's actually paid to edit Shelley's poetical works. She travels in Europe with Percy, her son, who never really amounted to much. That's another theme we could talk about too. I thought, well, we'll sort of bring this to a close. So she gets a book out of that, The History of a 6 Weeks Tour. 1851, she dies of a suspected brain tumor, and that's the end. There are some posthumously published things as well, and she's survived by her sister and by her son. And, I was thinking today as I was preparing for this, there's so many cases where we have brilliant people who really get a lot done in whatever format, literary, philosophical, political, and usually their kids aren't particularly gifted or ambitious or, and sometimes we don't want them to be. If you think about, like, this may sound a little mean, but Christopher Tolkien, right? Mm-hmm. We don't want Christopher Tolkien to be a great storyteller like his dad, so he could actually put together all the notes, because it requires a different kind of thing. You do want him to be a zealous defender of the estate, right? Frank Herbert's son, I don't know. The verdict is kind of out on that one. But so Mary Shelley is clearly a brilliant and underappreciated thinker. Her mother was a brilliant thinker, probably more brilliant than her dad when you look at the output and the influence that she's had. William Godwin wasn't a slouch, but he wasn't a Mary Wollstonecraft. So there you've got one case. But then her son, who she brought up, he's just kind of, he does what he does. He's not really that notable. And it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. I mean, there are plenty of cases where there are kids who do turn out to be great from great parents, but it usually doesn't continue on very long, And some people attribute it to, well, they're going to be spoiled, or they grow up without facing the adversity. I don't really think that's it. Maybe so many different factors have to come together just right in order to make things work. Like neither of my kids want to be philosophers. I tried to get them interested in that sort of thing, and they like talking about philosophical stuff, but neither one's attracted to the discipline. Yeah. So, But I did want to talk a little bit about some of these other literary things that she did. So, I mentioned that she wrote short stories, and we're going to talk about Mortal Immortal as one of them. I think that'd be a great one to hit on. So she wrote these short stories for what were called annuals. And these were aimed mostly at middle-class women. They would be bound in nice silk bindings, gilt-edged pages, and they needed good stories to fill in there, but nothing that would really shake the boat, right? And Mary Shelley said that she wrote this to Leigh Hunt. I write bad articles which help to make me miserable, but I'm going to plunge into a novel and hope that its clear water will wash off the mud of the magazine. So clearly she didn't value that sort of work that she was doing. It was kind of just mercenary, right? And that's too bad, because I think some of those stories are quite good. She also, she managed to publish 2 different travelogues, and one of these was in 1817 called The History of a 6 Weeks Tour. Her last full-length book is The Rambles in Germany and Italy in 1840, 1842, and 1843. And part of what she's doing there is following out her mother's own example. Mary Wollstonecraft had written letters written in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, and that was what got William Godwin to fall in love with her. So in a way, I mean, it's kind of interesting that there's all of that connection there. But it also afforded her an opportunity to like stick all sorts of other stuff in there, like all sorts of reflections on the nature of human beings and social customs, and isn't it funny that these people do things this way? And travel literature had been used in that way by that time. Think about like Montesquieu and his Persian letters or things along those lines. You can use literature, you can use other people's examples as ways to call your own into question. She also wrote, a number of different biographical entries, and in them she does the same sort of thing. She's interested in doing good history. She's also interested in reflection on the meaning of these people. So just a few of the ones that I think most of us would recognize that she wrote on. So I don't even know some of these people myself. That I won't mention the ones I don't. So she wrote on Petrarch, Boccaccio, Ficino, Pico della Mirandola. She's writing on these Renaissance figures in Italy. She wrote on Cervantes and Machiavelli, on Quevedo and Camões, Montaigne, Corneille, Molière, Pascal, Racine, Fenelon, Voltaire, Rousseau, Madame Roland, and Madame de Staël. All of these, and these are just a few of the ones that she actually wrote for that cyclopedia. And people, I haven't actually read any of these. People have looked at them and said, actually, these are really well-researched, well-thought-out biography. So, maybe she deserves to be recognized as a writer, less just as a novelist and more in sort of a broader scope. Again, sort of like her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote philosophical treatises. She also wrote novels that kind of, follow along those lines. She wrote a travelogue. She wrote all sorts of other interesting things as well. So the only other thing I wanted to bring up in terms of biography and literary stuff was The Last Man. So I went and I looked at some of the reviews of this, and it did not come out well. Reviewers didn't like the theme of lastness, which had become kind of a common thing apparently by that time. Individual reviewers said that the book had stupid cruelties in it. They were basically just name calling, But I thought it's just dull, unfortunately. You read a bit of it, right? Mm-hmm. What was your impression?
Yeah, I mean, it's a slow getting into, and I kept thinking of The Master of Ballantrae.
Okay.
I was kind of comparing it to that, which is that Robert Louis Stevenson, like his final work, and that thing's just crazy because it's it's kind of the height of both his adventure along with him doing kind of the ghost and the mystical.
Okay.
And it's really a psychological drama. And so I reading this one, I was like, oh, it's kind of that, but wanting.
There isn't much drama in it.
Right, that's what I mean. So I kept thinking, he's trying to get this other guy, and you're about to have like that sort of tension, and it resolves really fast, and you end up not having any of those aspects that you kind of expected to really. The tensions are just kind of. Not built in the same way and not resolved in the same way.
It almost feels picaresque, right? Where the things that are happening, there's no inherent need for them to go the way that they do.
Yeah.
But in a picaresque novel, you expect more of it. Apparently, it's what they call a Godwinian novel. And I don't know that much about that genre because I'm not a reader of Godwin. Other than philosophical stuff. Yeah. I don't know. Have you read any of his stuff?
No. The Mortal Immortal is also considered to be Godwinian.
That's interesting. I wonder why that's the case.
I don't know why. No, I just remember that's something that I saw because I'll like glance at it and like, oh, it's in the Godwinian style, and it wasn't well liked either.
Let's really as a short story.
Yeah,
and that's interesting because that's probably one of her best, most interesting ones. So let's talk about that one first. I mean, the theme is the thing I found most interesting about it. We should say for the people who are watching this, you got a guy who's working for an alchemist. He's in love with a woman. She's kind of a shrew in many ways, and throws him over for another guy. And he is the alchemist is trying to make an elixir of immortality. And I really like the description about like how it's going to be rose colored, and then it'll have sparks in it, golden sparks and stuff like that. And the alchemist tells him, okay, you watch, and then if it turns color, you wake me up and all that. But he tells the guy, this'll, because the guy says, well, what are we doing this for? He says, well, this'll cure love. You don't want to cure your love for this. I forget the name of the girl, but and it turns out the guy does want to cure love. So he takes it and he drinks half of it, and then it's dashed, and the alchemist is like, oh, you've destroyed my work, And, it turns out to be very enervating in a way. And he goes and he tells the girl what's what. And she responds to this new firmness on his part and vitality. And they get married. And then it turns out that he's half immortal. And it's I don't know if there's much other literature on that sort of problematic of the immortal who has to see everybody disappear and die.
Yeah.
Prior to that, I mean, they reference the story of the Wandering Jew, right? And there is a story about a guy in ancient Greece who's given eternal life, but they don't give him eternal youth, which is almost like the opposite of it. He goes senile and he gets transformed into a grasshopper or a cicada or something like that. And his wife, doesn't like it and wants him to be old like her, and he can't. And then it just sort of leaves off,
Yeah.
But it's an interesting idea. How do you know? Because he finds gray hairs. Mm-hmm. How do you know what half of eternity would be?
Yeah.
That's what I thought was the most interesting part of that.
Right.
Whatever length of time is supposed to be eternity, he gets half of it.
And he keeps wondering, when does this end? And it's kind of a fascinating story, because he's like, well, I can't commit suicide, but also no one seems to be killing me. Yeah. And so all these tensions, I want to die, but I'm not going to do this and this other thing. And so he ends up with these kind of conundrums of saying, well, how do I? He's like, I can't marry anyone else. I can't do love again because
it wouldn't be fair.
Yeah, I already saw her age and it was horrible.
Yeah. And he doesn't do what immortals immortals saved by getting killed do it in all sorts of other science fiction and fantasy stuff, which is go fight in wars and gain power, Roger Zelazny's Amber novels, right? These people screw around all the time. Literally, they screw a whole bunch of non-immortals and sire kids, and then they get in wars and build kingdoms and fight each other and stuff like that. And in the Kane novels, similar sort of situation. He's gloomy, but that doesn't prevent him from taking positions as generals or admirals or things like that. And whenever a spider's, giant spider's going to eat him and kill him, suddenly he discovers that he wants to live. There's nothing like that in this one.
Yeah. I mean, he's just kind of meandering along. Yeah, he hasn't accumulated wealth or power, which you'd think that he might. Although, given his prior history, you understand why he doesn't, because he's kind of this meek guy who only took the job in the first place because the girl was throwing him over because he had no money. And so he's got kind of he
doesn't become any more intellectually gifted though.
Right.
He doesn't go. I mean, if you or I were given that sort of thing, we'd be like, well, guess we're going to be spending a lot of time in the library.
Right.
You know, now I don't have to like prioritize among books because I got enough time to read them all.
Yeah.
You know, he doesn't do that at all.
No, and he was an alchemist's assistant, so you think, oh, he's going to make a new web himself. You know, why not? You know, be the new alchemist, and he doesn't do that either. It's fascinating, and he just basically spends a lot of time saying, how can I end this? And what does this look like?
You know, with The Last Man, too. He's the last human being in the world. What's he going to do? He's got a dog, and that's about it. There's, I guess, without other people that you can relate to. It's not just that other people existing in the world. Other people that you can relate to. Maybe life isn't. It's worth living in the sense of you can't kill yourself, but it's not valuable life.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of an interesting point. Well, let's talk about some of the key philosophical themes. So, you know, everybody's take on Frankenstein always focuses on the fact that, you know, you create a life, now, you know, what's going to happen? And there's a lot of takes on Frankenstein where, oh, technology, it's bad because, look, it created a new kind of being and look how miserable it made everybody. And I guess in this story that's true, but it doesn't have to be that way, you know. And I kind of like the idea of thinking about the creature sees him as a father and mother. And Frankenstein is a terrible father and mother to the creature. He doesn't take care of its education. He doesn't love it in any way. He betrays it when he's made a pact with it. Maybe when we do create. You know, so I mean, here's kind of turning the thing on its head. So people read this and they talk about, oh, you know, we've got to be careful about creating a Frankenstein monster. Well, maybe we don't create Frankenstein monsters if we actually treat the things that we create the right way. So, you know, what are the prospects for us? We may be able to create new human life. It probably won't be us because we have some ethical restrictions in place against doing that, but it's going to happen somewhere else in the world. The Chinese will do it, or some other technologically advanced civilization with less ethical restrictions or more secrecy will certainly do it. So that's one possibility: creating new human beings of some sort. Then there's the whole what are we doing with AI, robots, computer networks, all of that sort of stuff. Maybe those are life, maybe those are intellect eventually. I mean, Siri, I was just exploring with Andy the other day, and Siri is still pretty stupid. You know, even more stupid on the iPhone 10 with the current operating system than Siri seemed to be just a couple of years ago when I played around with it. There seem to be more things that Siri just can't process. So, you know, but eventually.
I have that with autocomplete on my Android, you know, and it goes back and now changes my sentence at the beginning.
Oh, yeah?
Whereas it used to just change the most so all of a sudden I come back and I'm like, there's a typo. I'm like, well, you changed it after I'd already written the sentence. You mean I have to reread the whole thing now?
You know, it's interesting that autocorrect, this is a total side note, but autocorrect is less useful the more intelligent of a writer you are, right? Because it's going to get more and more wrong with the stuff where, you're breaking a rule, but you know why you're breaking the rule, right?
Yeah.
Or you do want the longer word, you know? Yeah.
It's, but I mean, along the lines of that, I remember someone noting, I think he's a tech consultant. He was noting that there were some robots, and I can't remember if it was the Boston Robotics or if it was a different one. But people were kicking the robots.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a lot on Twitter. Is that where you saw it?
Yeah, I think it was on Twitter.
People were
this is what we want to be teaching the robots is violence.
This is how you get Skynet, right? Was the caption. Do you remember what the reason why they were doing it was?
No.
Oh, okay. So it gets more interesting. they're actually, it looks bad from the outside. The optics, as people say, are bad because you're like abusing the robot, you're knocking stuff out of its hands, which must be frustrating it, right? They're actually trying to get it to learn how to adjust to its environment.
I wasn't sure if some of them were actually the people working on it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, of course, there'll probably be some sadist who actually does do stuff like that just to screw with their robot. And if you think about like where we're going, one of the biggest applications, of course, of AI, because look at where everything else has gone with technology and the internet, it's going to be sex robots.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because if you think about like how video technology progressed, well, it was so people could, shoot each other having sex at home. And then the internet, so many of the sites are that. So it's inevitable that's going to be happening. And if they do if they are brought to some level of intelligence, there are going to be some people doing some pretty terrible stuff to them. And, maybe they'll talk with each other, and then maybe again, we go back to the thing. If you don't want a Frankenstein's monster, maybe treat the things that you're creating as new life better, right. Give them some reasons to think that we regular humans shouldn't be snuffed out.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. What do you think? Is that theme of like we got to be so careful, in creating artificial life? Has that been hashed out to death, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's available in the text, but I think that's one of the nice things about a novel is it's not trying to make that explicit argument.
Yeah.
You can.
That's right. People have drawn that out through criticism. They've been like, this is the main point of it, right?
Yeah. And I mean, again, it's latent in the text. It's available, certainly. But I wouldn't say that it, does it have to be the theme? Is it the theme? Is it the thing that we take from it?
Yeah.
And not that author intent is the end all and be all of it, is that even, in effect, what she had intended, because sometimes you'll hear it as even being this response to, falling in line with the pastoral sort of poets and that sort of thing, and this, it's like, oh.
Do you buy that reading of it?
No, I mean it's certainly, and some of that is, I mean, what was the inciting occasion?
Yeah.
And it's a group of people together telling ghost stories.
So it's got to be a story where something goes tragically wrong. Yeah. How is this a ghost story?
Well, that's which is actually an interesting question.
It's not really even a supernatural story because everything that's happening in it is supposed to be happening in accordance with the science of the time, right? Mm-hmm. Which, of course, it's not, but...
yeah, I mean, it's very much, science fiction in that sense, as opposed to...
a supernatural horror story or something like that.
Because, I would not put this alongside of, something like Poe's stuff or any of those things where...
Well, Poe does have a few very sciencey things, like the case of... is it the case of Monsieur Valdemar, the one where they've got a dead guy and they're using galvanism to bring him back from the very edge of death and get him to talk to them. And then, of course, it's terrible. He tells him what it's like to be dead, and he just wants to be like let to die. But I think it's the same sort of thing. They're fascinated with galvanism and its capacity to bring things back to life. Apparently, the original modern Prometheus, the first use of that was about Benjamin Franklin and his experiments with electricity.
Oh wow! I did not.
Kind of an interesting idea. The other thing that does come up is this fear about, and this is something that we have in our own time, fear about a new, stronger race being developed by us and then being able to reproduce. Mm-hmm. So if it's just one Frankenstein monster, that's cool. he's going to do crazy stuff and, be afraid of fire and, hurt a little girl or things like that, and then maybe kill a polar bear down the line. But if he can reproduce, then all bets are off for humanity, right? Yep. So we have a similar worry about technology when it comes to, we don't want AI to be able to reproduce itself.
Yep.
That's, then we have no way of controlling it after that. And then, we have science fiction-y things too about like creating artificial human beings who would be better than us in some ways. Like they would be physically stronger, mentally more intelligent, less restrained by psychological hang-ups, and then they'd replace us, right? That's the great fear. I think that's a theme that is definitely running through here, because why is it just he's giving a big screw you to the monster when he destroys the corpse bride, or is he really worried about the future of humanity? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean as you kind of mentioned earlier, there's that whole theme of anger coming into play, right? And then making these weird decisions because like they can kind of resolve or get along, and then a character gets upset or decides to anger the other character in some way, and then we're off again.
Yeah.
Which, unlike in The Last Man, where it kind of unfolds, like in this one, you actually do, and it's kind of interesting that you have it from both Frankenstein and his monster. They're both very human in that sense.
Yeah. And you get the idea that Wollstonecraft, I mean, she was writing this pretty young, so, and at an age where she's seeing a lot of anger in the household and its effects. Anger happens because we take offense at something. Either it is the way that we think it is, somebody's actually trying to screw with us or put us down in some way, or we just perceive it and then we're off to the races. And then, we could get over it, or we could just hold on to it. And it's rare that any of the characters ever, at the opportunities they have, get over it. And so it produces this wedge that just simply can't be overcome. And I thought down the line, I do all this work on anger. I thought it'd be very interesting just to go through this one text and look at every single instance of referencing anger, rage,
sure,
annoyance, that whole modality, and sort of plot out how important it is and what Shelley has to say about it in the text through the mouths of the characters.
Yeah. As we're talking about it now, it almost makes me wonder, and again, latent, not necessarily there, but possible in the text, if in part whether again she's doing it explicitly or just like unintentionally it happens, but there's some exploration of that idea of parentage and like children, like those
the anger between them.
Yeah, like and again, not just like that they're always antagonistic, but that sense of what is it between parent and child when they're in disagreement. And obviously Frankenstein does not want his child, which is another thing. And what I mean? And it's like, oh, and then what that has to do with those interactions of a child who feels unwanted, and how that anger kind of interplays.
And that is a theme that could run. I mean, there's so many people that can relate to that. Even if it's not just that like, it was totally unwanted and totally rejected by mom and dad. It could be, turns out that after a lot of soul searching and thinking about it, I'm gay, and mom and dad can't accept that. And then, you're out of, what do we do at the family, gatherings for Christmas? Do we talk about this or not? Or it could be... Right. It could be being rejected just for having the wrong sort of temperament, or a lot of times there's people who just they seem like they just can't relate to each other, and you see them from the outside, and you're like, man, what the hell's wrong with you people? You know, can't you see that he's trying to say this and he's trying to say this? But they somehow just can't put it together.
Yeah.
And children do want to be loved and have a safe family environment. I mean, you look at the Godwins, you know, they didn't provide a particularly good household for these kids. So yeah, not that Mary and Percy Shelley did either. But, yeah, so that, you know, I think that's something that's very relatable. Just like, you know, with the Odyssey, this is a bit of a digression, but, you know, I started thinking about this as I was listening to it on CD back in my early 40s. The first 3 or 4 books are all basically Telemachus and his story. And you think after all the, you know, tell me, O Muse, blah blah blah, the gods doing this and that, but it's all about Telemachus, and he's got to deal with these jerks who are trying to marry his mom because his dad is off, maybe dead, hoping his dad would come back, and he's now of age where he's got to sit, like, put his foot down, and he not only does he have to do that, but he also wants to do it. He hates these guys' guts. And, you know, when I was listening to it, I was thinking, wow, you know, I can totally relate to this as 18-year-old Greg. Mm-hmm. You know, my mom dating guys that I didn't like, and I mean, they weren't trying to take over our house or anything.
No, yeah,
but or plotting to kill me. But you know, that absent father, and now I've got to figure out what to do on my own, and you know, I don't have anyone I can rely on. I mean, Telemachus gets Athena, and gets some advice from Menelaus and Nestor. But there are these themes that are, you know, very relatable in terms of what we could call family dynamics or, you know, social dynamics. So yeah. What else? You know, is this? It gets framed as a gothic novel. It gets framed as a romantic novel. Are those good descriptors for it? Is it romantic? I mean, there's certainly some themes about the individual, and you know, it's you have a, you know, sort of romantic hero figure, larger than life, doing something against the norms. You know, there's a lot of the Paradise Lost is referenced by the monster himself, but I think there's also a lot of sort of imitation of Paradise Lost in the structure of the work itself. But you know, we often, I mean, I guess there's different kinds of romanticism, right? There's the romanticism of, like you said, the pastoralists. Oh, let's return to nature. Those mechanisms and wheels and cogs, they're bad, you know, tearing up the earth. Don't use galvanism. You know? Keep the electricity up in the clouds. This isn't like that. It's not as if she's rejecting all the technological progress and possibilities. And there's this fascination with creation of life. A lot of the romantic stuff also has to do with, like, defending your own and
right.
So I guess you could say it's a romantic novel, but it's not an optimistic romantic novel.
No, I mean, it's I'm trying to think, you know, some of the more, you know, gothic ones. You know,
The Last Man is more optimistic in some ways than Frankenstein is, because these people have conflicts, but they get over them. And then, you know, what brings them down? Plague and, you know, accidents in life and stuff like that. You're able to get through the issues more easily, I think.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
I'm Oh, I was just saying, in terms of it, the framing is, the gothic sense of it. I was just trying to think of other.
Oh, similar ones?
Yeah.
This is something that I was thinking about as well. So this becomes part of film adaptation, right? So does Dracula. But those are written a long distance apart from each other in time. And yet we have this kind of horror/Victorian, what should we call it, like stable or catalog of like stock characters, right? Frankenstein's monster, of course, Dracula, the Wolfman, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. What else gets added into that? Sort of famous monster types that can easily be put onto screen because they're all anthropomorphic.
Right.
They had Dorian Gray becomes kind of a character and that sort of thing. Although I think that's later on. Invisible Man.
Yeah.
Gets and after a while, like the fact that some of these are very far apart from each other in time, really from radically different generations. In the film stuff, they may as well all be from the same era, right? Mm-hmm. By our time. So you could have something like The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen being put together as a movie, drawing on quite a few of those figures. Or you think back to like Laurel and Hardy, right? There's Laurel and Hardy and the Wolfman, Laurel and Hardy and Frankenstein. The Mummy, that was another one that came up, right? And so you get a whole bunch of them. You can even think of it in terms of those serials, right? We had Frankenberry and Count Chocula and Fruit Brute, that was the werewolf, right? By the time that it can be commodified like that, all of these have become part of a collective of monsters.
Well, the Mummy's history would be interesting. How much of that would be, actually even early 20th century with the opening of some of the tombs. And the 19th. How much of that was based on ideas of those curses from opening them versus
that would almost be the latest stuff, right? Because Stoker is 1890s, 1900s.
Yeah. With Polidori, we really have a vampire tale coinciding with. That one's kind of funny because that coincides with Frankenstein. The funny thing about Polidori's tale is people thought Byron always wrote it.
Okay.
And now people think that Polidori wrote it with Byron being the vampire. And there's a fair bit of evidence that may be the case, which is pretty funny. So we do. Yeah,
it's not like vampire stories weren't around before.
Right, but Stoker takes it to that next level. But Polidori at least. Gives a significant one, early draft.
Yeah.
I still.
Mummies have to be kind of later.
Yeah.
Lovecraft has some Egyptian stuff in there, but again, he's 20s and 30s. Well, 10s, 20s, 30s. So yeah.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating.
Yeah, I thought it's almost impossible to talk about Frankenstein, I think, without talking about the adaptations. The other theme that I wanted to hit on, that I called the imperfection of the perfectible. The Romantics were, even though they were rejecting a good bit of the Enlightenment, the one thing that most of them did accept was the perfectibility of humankind.
Yeah.
That we could make progress, and not only as individuals but as society. We could get better and better and better by stages. And Mary Wollstonecraft actually said, listen, you're never actually going to even have like really good relations between men and women until you fix things in society, except for some very rare exceptions. And even then you may have tragic cases. So let's work on fixing the society. And I think Frankenstein and, some of the stories and even The Last Man, there's always imperfections in whatever is being perfected. Things always fall through. So you don't get a story of a steady incline. Instead, there's an incline, and then there's a fall, and then there's maybe some troughs in there, and then it go fall even further.
Yeah, well, even with immortality, I mean, you normally think of that.
Oh,
being
yeah. Immortality is a great thing until you've got it, and now what the hell are you going to do with it? Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that immortality would be a perfection in a sense of you've brought something to its complete fulfillment. Yeah, that's actually another theme that goes beyond Mary Shelley and is a sort of classic theme. What do you do when you actually get what you want? Like let's say you actually could have not just immortality, but like a super heightened intellect. Would that actually lead you to being happy, or would that make you less happy? Because now you actually understand that the universe doesn't give a shit about anything. You realize just how much you'll never actually be able to know, even with being immortal.
Completion. You've got the Midas touch that doesn't end well. You have similar Solomon asking for wisdom, right? And he still, the writings that are attributed to him, vanity.
even his own life. He used some wisdom early on, and then he kind of screwed up the nation he was in charge of, even though he made it very prosperous and powerful, And then his son screwed it up after him, Mm-hmm. Rehoboam loses the 10 northern kingdoms, essentially telling him that he's going to be tougher on him than his dad was. Not a smart move. I was just remembering a Rick and Morty thing, actually, where early on Rick was talking about school, and he says, it's not for smart people. This is something actually I think a lot of people go through when they go off to college and they encounter these people, especially if they come from a family background where, like, say, they're first generation college, and they think academics are supposed to like have it together and be intelligent and all that, and you engage with these people, and some of them really are, mm-hmm. at least at the time that you're encountering them, and then the rest of them you're like, what the hell is wrong with these people? They're saying this, and I know this is wrong, or I see through the story that they're telling already. Maybe I'd be better off just reading on my own. So getting everything that you want doesn't always produce great happiness. The other thing too is if you're really intelligent, you might look at all the different things that we offer people in our society and be like, that's not actually that good, You can sort of see through things. So I don't know. Maybe that wouldn't make us happy. There's always some sort of imperfection that only emerges when we move to the next stage. Like Frankenstein, he doesn't think about, what's going to happen with this monster once he doesn't even think I'm creating a monster, right? What's going to happen when I create this thing? He doesn't know.
It's not going to haunt my footsteps. Oh.
Kill all my family. Yeah. Destroy my life. I guess the last thing we should talk about too is because they're going to kick us out before too long. So the narrative structure, mm-hmm. right? Story within a story within a story. I actually like that myself. I think it's kind of a good storytelling technique for this. Somebody, I don't remember, some critic complained that each of the narrators talks too similarly to each other. I don't know that I see that as a terrible flaw myself.
It's, if you look at enough even like travel literature or adventure literature that time period, in historical distance, it actually seems very similar present day.
Yeah.
But if you think of genre, how different would they be if they're
in terms of narrative voice.
Yeah, in terms of because it's like these are the stylistic moves that we make.
Yeah. I mean, they are different. So the story within the story, you get the captain first, right? And he tells the story about finding this guy, this crazy guy, who has this wild story, and that's Frankenstein himself. And then Frankenstein's monster gets a story dropped within there as well. It seems to me like the three narratives, the diction is the same, but the motives of the characters telling the story are very different. And the first part of it, the framing part, is, well, I don't know if this guy's actually telling, I don't know if everything he's saying is true or not, but here's what he said. And then you get, we get further into it,
And for me, it's almost like, he said, so it's still from the first narrator's voice. You could almost take it that way, where it's them doing the other person's story, but then it's still going to have something of their own style.
Yeah.
So I mean, I've never found that, but it is a fun structure. I've always enjoyed that aspect. You have to get into it, certainly. It's actually, it's somewhat of a sidebar, but I have a freshman in high school, and we'll be getting into Mary Shelley later, and having to right now work through some shorter stories of that era, just to get her used to the cues of how they're writing, and with the different narrators, and that sort of thing. So we've done like 2 Lord Dunsany works, and his stuff's dry, interesting but dry.
Yeah.
And then a few others, and it's kind of funny because she's like, "Oh, I really like that story." And I was like, "Oh, I thought that one was kind of dry."
Yeah, there's so much preoccupation, even running all the way into the early 20th century with social niceties and narrating those sorts of things.
Yeah.
That I think a lot of our younger readers just they don't know what that stuff is about.
Yeah, I mean, the YA genre is a relatively newer thing, and that's where we put a lot of their reading time and energy, and so
that's true.
Coming into these other pieces, it's a little bit of a shift. I mean, even within certain fantasy, like YA fantasy, I'll read stuff, the one like Newbery Medals in the 80s, and I'm thinking of The Hero and the Crown, and which actually the Blue Sword is a prequel to it.
Okay.
I
don't think I know that.
The prequel one, it was like an honor, and then the other one, and the kids can't read it.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, they're just like, because it's similar, even like Lewis will be a grind for a lot of students. And it's just fascinating to me that, and again, not that they can't read it, but it actually takes more effort than some of the ones with the way
it requires
they
a sort of not apprenticeship, but some sort of.
Well, it starts off introspective, and so it's like, and then it even has a flashback within a flashback.
Okay.
Which if you're used to that, like, oh, this is like nothing, you're just going by it. Whereas, and the action is late.
Keeping track of narrative structures, like how deep are you going in? Mm-hmm. That is a skill. Another skill. And again, this is totally off topic, but when I'm teaching philosophy texts, if it's let's say Platonic dialogues or Aristotle and his approach to things, doing things very dialectically, or say René Descartes posing things and then saying no, that's not the case, or David Hume setting up opponents' arguments to demolish them, and everything in between. It's really difficult for them, and I don't know if this is a generation thing, if it's gotten worse over time, because I know this was a problem when I first started teaching students 20 years ago, and I think it was also a problem sometimes for some of my own fellow grad students. They couldn't keep track of when an author was putting forth a position as somebody else's position, and when the author is putting forth a position as their own position. When they're putting forth a position in order to attack it or critique it, and when they're actually endorsing it.
Yeah.
Because there's plenty of times where Socrates says, so what you're saying is blah, 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 and he's not saying that because he's, going to agree with that. He's gonna knock it down in just a minute.
Yeah. Well, he's the worst for that one.
Well, other people who I think would be kind of difficult. Nietzsche, for example. Nietzsche is constantly referencing other people's things, and sometimes quite obliquely. And it's understandable that students are like, what the hell is this soup in front of me? What are the points what's he actually saying, Because not everybody will develop things in a sort of, here's axiom 1, here's axiom 2, now that leads to this, It's pretty rare in any sort of intellectual work.
Yeah.
So... Yeah, it's kind of an interesting worry. So if we don't, it's one thing we can teach individual students, or we can teach an elite how to read this sort of literature productively.
Right.
But if we're not doing that on a broad base,
yeah, what are we doing?
What sort of prospects are there for whatever it is that we're trying to continue on,
Yeah.
Reading has always been a minority occupation, even in the time when things like this were quite popular.
Yeah.
How should we view that sort of thing? What's your take? You're deep in the heart of it yourself.
It's problematic. You lose some of the tools of understanding. Well, yeah, some of the tools of understanding. Like, how do we? One of the themes that are available within Mary Shelley allow you to talk about the present day while going back into the fantastical and historical past.
Yeah, it gives you more anchor points. Yeah.
And certainly you can have them present day, but we have to make certain that we have some of them.
Yeah.
And not just as the latest and greatest, which isn't a theme that she's getting at. But you can find it in dystopian literature in the 20th century and more present day, where you kind of end up chasing your own tail, and as Neil Postman eventually gets to, it ends up being trivia, and I think that can be a thing, and we don't want Mary Shelley to become trivia either. Certainly you've got your Cliff Notes version of her. It's like, oh, here's the theme, and you're like, okay,
yeah. Or the Wikipedia breakdown, or.
But I think there will be questions of how do we bring that back. In terms of philosophy, in terms of literature, making certain that we're still grappling with these ideas, because we can say, oh, we figured out all the stuff that Mary Shelley has presented, but we haven't. And each generation kind of, will discover her text anew to a degree, which is part of the reason she's still read.
Yeah, it's interesting. If the current generation, well, not the current, if the generation who are kids right now and just entering college right now, what we call Generation Z, have a genuine prospect in their lifetime of, if not true artificial intelligence, certainly incredibly sophisticated algorithms, programs, hardware, networks, things like that certainly could approximate or imitate intelligence in very sophisticated ways. This can be an analog for it, but there's a lot of mapping that would have to take place.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because they're not working with meat machines of sewn together corpses and galvanism or anything like that. So there's a lot of translation that would have to take place, right?
Absolutely.
So I guess one of the questions I'd ask is, how do you see? It's one thing to say, oh yeah, it's dealing with the same theme and do so at a very general level, but that doesn't get them to the point to be able to think constructively and critically about that at sort of like the intermediate level where the real action happens.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? How do we get them to? How do we promote that?
Well, I mean, somewhat related to that, and we were talking about it before we started with Alistair McIntyre, where you were mentioning he talks about dilemmas, and he said, one of the ways he resolves dilemmas is to go say, well, how did we get here? It's not the present, it's not the future.
Okay.
We got here, from this pathway, and not that this is leading us to that pathway, but as that past anchor, allowing for that and saying we can have this thought back here because there's this space. And I've seen it a few times in doing nonfiction pieces, that are contemporary, where then they point back, and like there's one, I remember it's called The Algorithmic Self. And so giving them that as initial fodder. Yeah. And then when they get into this...
So this is kind of cultural literacy basis for that, but then that raises the question, in order to have cultural literacy, do you really need to read the book, the whole book, and have read through it several times and thought about it? Or can you rely on the Cliff Notes version that gives you, as people, the gist, or the bullet points, or...
I mean, for this one, because it's been translated into film, I honestly am not familiar with the films of it. I can think of...
Well, it's like a trope now, almost, right?
Yeah. Because the original Dracula, which wasn't called Dracula...
Nosferatu.
Yeah. I mean, that one, you actually get quite a bit.
Yeah.
And so...
That's pretty close to the story.
Yeah.
Right? The Frankenstein's monster in film and TV adaptations very quickly becomes dissociated from Frankenstein himself. I mean, that's part of why you can call it the monster of Frankenstein, right?
Yeah.
And becomes just this scary meat thing.
Yeah, I think the amount of internal wrestling gets lost with that.
Yeah, I mean, so in Penny Dreadful, which used it recently, and there was also a Frankenstein recently too, that had Sean Bean in it. The monster does talk about, oh, my life sucks, why did you make me, and all that sort of. So you get that, but there's no necessity of it. You can just have the guy with the bolts in his neck, and, stuff like that, running around chasing Abbott and Costello.
Yeah. So
or Scooby Doo.
So it's interesting. I mean, I wonder if there is a way to translate it around into a different medium that it would work well in. But I think it is an interesting one, and part of it is that written form of working your brain through it. And I think there are some works that, as your brain works through them, they work on you. Shakespeare's like that, where his stories aren't that interesting. He copied other stories half the time, but it's the actual words.
Yeah.
And that's even like the No Fear Shakespeare. You've lost the whole moment.
Yeah, there's arguments being made in Shakespeare quite often, and there's arguments being made here, maybe to a lesser extent. Maybe there's more expostulations.
Sure.
You son of a bitch. She never has him say that, but
but essentially,
wretched creature.
But I imagine that there would be ways of, that you could do it other than this particular piece. But I think this piece is a very good one for that. I guess would be.
There's another thing too, that kind of speaks for it. So it gets taught a lot in high schools, right? I think still.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it provides us with at least a common basis where we can say, listen, you've all read Frankenstein, right?
Yeah.
Do you remember this and that? So maybe that recommends it and then helps to keep it in circulation over and over again. Yeah. I think we better bring this to a close. So thanks very much for a good conversation, and
thank you for hosting.
Yeah, so nice kickoff to the year, and one book to recommend, one book to recommend if you're really, really into dry stuff.